Good evening. I'm Jeff Bennett.
And I'm Amna Nawaz. On the NewsHour tonight, in a win for reproductive rights advocates, the Supreme Court unanimously votes to protect access to the abortion pill mifepristone.
The latest on the war in Ukraine as G7 leaders meet in Italy and announce a deal to use frozen Russian assets to support the war-torn country.
And a look at the debate surrounding arming teachers as more states pass legislation allowing educators to carry guns on school grounds.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
a law partner rediscovers her grandmother's artistry and creates a trust to keep the craft alive. A Raymond James financial advisor gets to know you, your passions, and the way you enrich your community. Life well planned.
Cunard is a proud supporter of public television. On a voyage with Cunard, the world awaits. A world of flavor, diverse destinations, and immersive experiences. A world of leisure and British style. All with Cunard's White Star service.
Carnegie Corporation of New York, working to reduce political polarization through philanthropic support for education, democracy, and peace. More information at carnegie.org. And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. There was major news out of the Supreme Court today as a decision came down in a highly anticipated reproductive rights case where the justices protected access to widely used abortion pills.
In a unanimous decision, the court ruled that a group of anti-abortion doctors does not have any legal basis to challenge access to mifepristone. That's one of the two common drugs used in medication abortion. As a result, access to mifepristone will not change. Let's bring in our John Ye. John, it's great to have you here. So this ruling did not address the underlying issues that the plaintiffs raised, instead deciding the case only on standing. That this decision was unanimous, was that surprising?
Not entirely. The oral arguments back in March really focused on this question of standing. Did the doctors have the legal right to sue? And in his opinion, the unanimous opinion today, Justice Kavanaugh essentially said, no, they don't have a direct personal stake in this. Because they're anti-abortion doctors, because they are morally opposed to abortion, they don't prescribe mifepristone, they don't perform abortion procedures. So what they were challenging was the regulation of other doctors who did, and you can't do that in our system.
There's another big abortion-related case that we're waiting on that has to do with abortion law in Idaho. Does this ruling in any way give an indication of what might be to come out of the Idaho case?
I don't think so, not really, because it's a totally different question. The question in Idaho is whether they're essentially total ban on abortion. The only exception is to save the life of the mother. Whether that violates the federal law that says that hospitals have to provide emergency treatment to stabilize a patient, even if it's not saving their life. And in that oral argument, there were all sorts of real-world examples of doctors airlifting patients out of Idaho so they could get the medical treatment that they thought they needed.
So mifepristone remains available to women up to the 10th week of pregnancy. It's still available through the mail. What's next? Does this case resolve any of the debate, the lingering fight around abortion pills?
Well, as you said, Jeff, they didn't get to the merits on this one. And there are 3 Republican-led states, Missouri, Kansas, and Idaho, that want to press this case. This fight against mifepristone. That's going to be going on at the district court level. It may take a little while to reach the Supreme Court. And then, of course, there's the Comstock Act. That's that 19th century law that makes it illegal to send materials that could lead to an abortion through the mail. And the Justice Department currently says that does not apply to prescriptions for mifepristone, but anti-abortion activists are already talking about trying to use that law to ban medicinal abortions if there's a new Trump administration.
All right, John Yang, thanks so much for walking us through all of this. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
In the day's other news, Evan Gershkovich will stand trial in the Russian city of Yekaterinburg, where he was arrested more than a year ago. For the first time, Russian prosecutors specified the allegations against the Wall Street Journal reporter, accusing him of spying on a military factory for the CIA with, quote, painstaking conspiratorial methods. Gershkovich, his employer, and the U.S. government have denied any wrongdoing. It's not clear when the trial will begin. The Justice Department has found a pattern of civil rights abuse at the Phoenix Police Department. This includes discrimination against Black, Hispanic, and Native American people and the use of excessive force. In its 126-page report, the department found that officers use, quote, dangerous tactics that lead to force that is unnecessary and unreasonable. The findings come after a nearly 3-year investigation into complaints of brutality by city law enforcement. The head of the Federal Aviation Administration said today that his agency was, quote, too hands-off with Boeing leading up to a mid-flight incident in January. Administrator Michael Whitaker was referring to the door plug blowout aboard an Alaska Airlines flight. Testifying to a Senate committee today, Whitaker admitted that the FAA was too focused on paperwork audits and not on actual inspections.
We have changed that approach over the last several months, and those changes are permanent. We have now moved to a more active, comprehensive oversight model, the audit plus inspection approach, which allows the FAA to have much better insight into Boeing's operations.
Also on Capitol Hill today, lawmakers in the House grilled Microsoft President Brad Smith on his company's plan to improve its security. That comes after China-linked hackers stole 60,000 State Department emails by breaking into Microsoft systems last summer. Smith took responsibility for the attack and said the company is working on reducing its engineering presence in China. U.S. officials granted the Makah tribe in Washington state a waiver to hunt gray whales today. The decision paves the way for what would be the tribe's first permitted hunt since 1999. The Makah had hunted whales for hundreds of years, but quit in the early 20th century after commercial whaling shrank populations. The tribe has spent more than 2 decades trying to resume the practice. Even with the waiver, the Makah will still need a permit, which could take months, and animal rights groups could challenge the decision in court. Tropical downpours pounded southern Florida for a 3rd day in a row today, adding to the already life-threatening floods in the area. Parts of Miami have seen more than 20 inches of rain since Tuesday. The nonstop precipitation has turned roads into rivers, submerging vehicles and stranding drivers. Aerial footage early today showed entire neighborhoods underwater. Longtime residents of Hollandale Beach, north of Miami, say they've never seen anything like it.
13 years, there's been storms, there's been rain, heavy rain, but never like this. This is extreme. This is a little bit too much. We was not expecting this.
The severe weather comes at the start of what's expected to be an extraordinary hurricane season. Weather officials say La Niña conditions are likely to form this summer, which typically lead to more hurricanes forming in the Atlantic. The head of the Senate Judiciary Committee said today that Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas took 3 undisclosed trips on a private jet provided by a Republican megadonor. The flights took place between 2017 and 2021. The committee notes that these trips were not included in an amendment filed last week to Thomas's 2019 financial disclosure. In a statement, committee chairman Dick Durbin said this new information, quote, makes it crystal clear that the highest court needs an enforceable code of conduct because its members continue to choose not to meet the moment. President Biden will nominate Christy Goldsmith Romero as the new head of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC. Goldsmith Romero is a longtime federal financial regulator who currently serves at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. If confirmed by the Senate Banking Committee, she would replace Martin Gruenberg, who agreed to resign last month after reports of workplace harassment and abuse at the agency. New data out today shows signs of cooling in the U.S. economy. The Producer Price Index, which monitors prices before they reach consumers, dropped last month by its largest amount since October. And the number of Americans filing for unemployment benefits climbed to a 10-month high. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said on CNBC this morning that this latest data shows this economy is settling into a more natural rhythm.
The labor market has become a little less hot, a little bit more normal. And so the labor market now is resembling what it looked like pre-pandemic. Right. Wages are increasing, but at a slower rate. And so that doesn't really look like it's a threat to inflation.
The latest readings come a day after the Fed signaled it would only lower interest rates once this year. That's down from an earlier projection of 3 cuts. And on Wall Street today, stocks were largely unchanged. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 65 points to close at 38,647. The Nasdaq notched its 4th straight record close, adding 59 points. And the S&P 500 also ended at a new high. Still to come on the NewsHour, former President Trump returns to Capitol Hill for the first time since the January 6th insurrection to meet with Republican lawmakers. Lifelong GOP supporters use a down-ballot race in Pennsylvania to voice disapproval of the extremism they see in their party. And Oscar-winning director and artist Steve McQueen discusses his new immersive exhibit.
This is the PBS NewsHour from WETA Studios in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
President Biden signed a defense pact today with Ukraine on the sidelines of the G7 meeting in Italy. The group of 7 major industrialized powers also agreed on a plan to take Russian assets held in Europe and use that money to aid Ukraine in its fight against Russia's invasion. Here's Nick Schifrin.
Another day, another direct Russian hit on a Ukrainian apartment in Kharkiv. But this day proved different. A man buried alive was saved, providing hope to a country struggling to hold the line.
An historic new bilateral security agreement.
And so it was 2,000 miles away. A security agreement gave Ukraine's leader hope U.S. support would hold.
Our goal is to strengthen Ukraine's credible defense and deterrence capabilities for the long term.
It's a truly historic day, and we have signed the strongest agreement between Ukraine and the U.S. since our independence.
Today's U.S.-Ukraine bilateral security agreement commits the U.S. for 10 years to, quote, support Ukraine's efforts to win today's war and deter future Russian military aggression, with weapons, intelligence sharing, and long-term training, as well as joint weapons production. Nowhere has the risk to Ukraine and the importance of Western support been more pronounced than in Kharkiv. Armata! Just a few weeks ago, the center of Vovchansk along the Kharkiv-Russia border had been gutted at risk of occupation. Now, U.S. and Ukrainian officials say newly arrived Western ammunition and permissions to fire U.S. weapons into Russia allowed Ukraine to hold the line. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin at NATO today.
But what I see is a slowing of the Russians' advance and a stabilizing of that particular piece of the front.
Above the summit today, skydivers leap to the waiting leaders of the world's largest democracies. They are collectively supporting Ukraine today, but they know long-term U.S. support could be a leap of faith because former and would-be President Trump has vowed to end the war in Ukraine and question ongoing U.S. military assistance. Today, Zelensky said no matter the president, he had faith in the American people.
It seems to me that no matter who the nation chooses, if the people are with us, any leader will be with us in the struggle for our freedom.
Today, the world's leading democracies also agreed to an unprecedented step, convert the interest on $280 billion of frozen Russian assets currently held in Europe into a loan to help Ukraine buy weapons and repair nearly $500 billion of damage. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen.
It's not the European taxpayers that are paying for the damage that Putin is causing with his war of aggression, but it is Putin.
And to discuss that part of the story, how the West is converting frozen Russian assets into a loan for Ukraine, I turn to Adam Smith, a partner at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher and a former senior advisor in the Treasury Department in the Obama administration. Adam Smith, thanks very much. Welcome back to the NewsHour. How significant is this announcement today?
It's a watershed. Quite simply, it could change the nature of sanctions. This can change the nature of the way sovereign powers around the world think about their own assets. This was a significant issue. It's been thought about since the day after Russia invaded Ukraine back in 2022. And the fact that they've done it now 2 years hence suggests how difficult it was, I think, for all parties to get around the idea of going after sovereign assets.
So explain more how exactly it is so existential or so significant, and I guess take us through some of the concerns that European countries had, and in fact some U.S. officials had initially about making this move.
Yeah, I think there are two concerns. One is perhaps a little less significant than the other. The first is retaliation. What that means is that if we can do that to Russia, Russia can do that to us. And that's true, and it's definitely a concern for the Europeans because there's a lot more engagement between Russia and Europe. It's much less of a concern for the US, but it's not a zero-sum concern. But of course, if Russia can do it, then others can do it as well, be it China, India, what have you, any other jurisdiction that sort of wants to. The other issue, of course, is what does it mean systemically? I mean, one of the linchpins of global finance is the fact that sovereign assets have historically been essentially inviolable, right? You can't go after them. And if we're undoing that, so the fact that anyone who keeps their assets in the United States, for example, which many, many countries do because they're invested in treasury bills or otherwise, and if all of a sudden that's a risk because they could theoretically be seized, taken, or otherwise immobilized, that's a significant risk for the way global finance has been structured heretofore.
So the risks presumably still exist today after the announcement. How were those concerns overcome?
Well, they're overcome, I think, through a little bit of legal trickery. So for the Europeans and the U.S. alone, U.S. as well, they're actually not going to be seizing Russian assets per se. The $300 billion worth of assets, 2/3 of which are in Europe, a tiny portion of which were in the United States. What they're actually going to do is they're basically going to use the interest on those assets. So the $180 billion worth of Russian assets sitting in Europe obviously creates interest, and the smaller amount in the US also has interest, much like a savings account. And what they're going to do is use that interest, not the principal rather, but the interest, to collateralize a $50 billion loan to Ukraine. So it's not only removed from the perspective of the principal, so the underlying asset of Russia is not going to be touched, just the interest. But on top of that, they're actually only going to sort of take that if, quote unquote, the loan that they're giving to Ukraine is not repaid. So it's just collateral, essentially, rather than going after a direct seizing of Russian assets by either the Europeans or the Americans.
And so there's been a lot of discussion politically in this country whether the U.S. should continue to send money to Ukraine or whether it should be structured as a loan. The language today is a $50 billion loan. Is that the kind of loan that the U.S. and the West expects to be paid back?
I don't think so. I mean, who knows? But I certainly don't think that's the idea. I haven't seen what the terms of the loan are. They're very, very long terms for repayment. Then it becomes sort of a null issue. So in other words, the loan may not be repaid, but it may not ever be due also. But I don't think that anyone thinks this is anything other than, frankly, Russia paying for some of the funds that the West is trying to send to Ukraine.
Jake Sullivan has made this point in the last 24 hours that this is the political agreement by the leaders of the 7 largest democracies in the world. What comes next? What technicalities have to be worked out?
Just how to move the assets and how to sort of engage with the interest payments. Now, the Europeans have already done this in a way. So they've got $180 billion sitting in an account. They actually have established a separate account or separate accounts for those interest payments. The U.S. has not done that, but they will need to do that, and I think they can do that fairly simply with sort of an administrative action. But then they need to structure a loan that that is approved, of course, by all parties, including the Ukrainians, and then you figure out how to collateralize it by virtue of those assets that are now sort of separated. In other words, the interest payment assets just need to be separated and tied to whatever loan agreement is finalized with Kyiv.
And finally, another major economic move by the U.S. this week has been additional sanctions, including secondary sanctions on any country or entity that is helping Russia's defense industrial base. That is pointed at China. U.S. officials say China have sent a lot of dual-use items that have really propped up Russia's industrial base. How significant is it that the U.S. is finally, after many people called for this, instituting secondary sanctions really pointed at China and Chinese companies?
Potentially very significant. This is a continuation of activity that began at Christmas last year with a new executive order. The secondary sanctions that were issued yesterday are very meaningful with respect to who they're targeting. But as it always is the case, we need to figure out enforcement. So it's one thing to put someone on a sanctions list. It's another thing to make sure parties are not dealing with those persons on the sanctions list. And that's where enforcement comes to bear. And that's where the Europeans and the US and others need to really gear up activity.
Adam Smith, thank you very much.
Thank you.
In his first trip to Capitol Hill since the January 6th attack, former President Trump today met behind closed doors with congressional Republicans. Republicans aim to use the visit as a display of unity following Mr. Trump's conviction in his New York hush money case last month.
We have great unity. We have great common sense. A lot of very smart people in this room and a lot of people that love our country.
Following the meetings and a busy day on Capitol Hill is John Bresnahan, co-founder of Punchbowl News. So, Bres, this is a former president who helped to incite a violent insurrection last time he was on Capitol Hill. Many other Republican lawmakers he was meeting with today were there that day, running for safety. How did they receive him today back on Capitol Hill?
Well, it was interesting because there were two different meetings. He met with House Republicans in the morning, and that was kind of more of a raucous meeting. And then after there were some news stories about what happened, what he said there, Trump seemed to take a more sober, serious approach when he met with Senate Republicans later in the day. It was fascinating because you did have, for instance, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who was who fell out with Trump after the election in 2020. He made the serious sin of saying that President Joe Biden actually won the election. Trump went on to attack McConnell for a long time in really derisive terms. He attacked McConnell's wife, former Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao, in racist terms. But today, McConnell and Trump shook hands and, had a nice conversation. You had on the House side, you had, for instance, you had Dan Newhouse, a member from Washington State. He voted to impeach Trump after the January 6th insurrection. Today, he attended the Trump event. So this was bowing to reality. Trump is the nominee. He's the head of the party. His stranglehold on the party remains. And, Republicans, if you want to get along in the Republican Party, you have to, bow to Trump. And that's the reality that they face today.
There's a lot happening among lawmakers today. I want to ask you, too, about Republican Senator J.D. Vance's move today, pledging to block President Biden's judicial nominees and U.S. attorney nominations in what he called his response to the current administration's persecution of former President Trump. We have seen previous Republican senators, Senator Tuberville, for example, block military nominations for months at a time. Is this a path Republicans want to and are willing to go down again?
Well, this is a little bit different. What Vance and several other senators were saying today, they were going to expand their blockade against Biden nominations. All judicial nominations and all U.S. attorney, or almost nearly all U.S. attorney nominations, they already have to go through. They're already filibustered by Republicans, but those are high stakes nominations, and the Senate Democrats are willing to go to the floor and plow through those, go through the process. It takes time, but they can do it. What Vance said today was, we're going after even ceremonial nominations, like Barbara Lee to be on the UN, Barbara Lee, a Democrat from California, to be on a UN advisory council. I mean, this is a ceremonial position. This is a member of Congress. These are usually things they give deference to each other on. And this should sail through unanimously. But they're saying, if the Democrats want to do this, they're going to have to spend time on it. And their betting is that the Democrats won't, because they're going to try and focus on judicial nominations and other more important nominations. What it is just another sign that they, again, this is J.D. Vance, who's of Ohio, the Republican senator from Ohio. He is very interested in being a vice president, and he is doing this to help himself with Trump, to help raise his status with Trump. And this was an important thing where he's trying to, raise his own profile. So that's what he was trying to do here. Again, this just shows you how partisan things have gotten in Capitol Hill. In an election year, a presidential election year, where the White House is up for grabs, the Senate and the House is up for grabs. So everything is, just a slugfest.
Brez, I have less than a minute left, but I have to ask you about this other move. A Democratic bill moved forward to protect IVF nationwide. Republicans blocked it, except for 2 Republicans who voted in favor of it, Senators Murkowski and Collins. Senate Republicans then went on to sign a letter saying that they support IVF, that this bill was just too broad. In short, is this still a politically vulnerable issue for them?
Oh, yeah, this is a very serious issue. I mean, there was a vote on contraception last week. There's a vote on IVF today. This is an issue that millions of Americans have, and probably every American knows somebody who's had used IVF to help have a kid or have children. And so there's a lot of support for this. Republicans have said, that they want to enshrine this in the law, but, they don't want to do what the Democrats did. So Democrats are using this to raise the issue on abortion and contraception and women's rights, and that that Republicans are, want to march the country backwards. And that's why these show votes, they're symbolic, but they're important. That's why this is an important issue.
Jon Bresnahan, co-founder of Punchbowl News. Always good to see you. Thank you.
Thanks.
In 2020, President Biden won Pennsylvania by less than 2 points. For the president and his Republican rival, Donald Trump, winning Pennsylvania in November is key to winning the White House. But some lifelong Republicans, frustrated by their party's embrace of Donald Trump, are getting involved down ballot. Our White House correspondent, Laura Barone Lopez, has more. Laura?
Thanks, Jeff. In South Central Pennsylvania, the NewsHour met up with GOP voters ready to make a point about the direction of their party. Their focus, the race for the 10th Congressional District.
So I have some remarks.
In an election year, it's not unusual for a group of local Republicans to meet up. But these Republicans are meeting to help elect a Democrat.
We can't lose our ability to be outraged. We need to be outraged.
Craig Snyder, a Republican political organizer in Pennsylvania, is gathering other like-minded conservatives in the state. They're fed up with the 2020 election conspiracies and the unwavering loyalty to Donald Trump that have become defining features of their party. To counter the former president, they're focusing their sights down ballot. The target? 6-term Pennsylvania Congressman Scott Perry, a faithful Trump ally who spread lies that the 2020 election was stolen.
How can he say that the conviction, the lawful due process conviction of Donald Trump, was worse for American democracy than the violent mob that stormed our Capitol, defecated in our Capitol?
Their group, Republicans Against Perry, is hoping to encourage moderate Republicans to back the Democratic contender.
The nation is watching this seat.
Janelle Stelson, who until this election cycle was a registered Republican and local news anchor.
When you pay attention to what Scott Perry's been doing, he is so extreme. He doesn't even vote with his Republican colleagues most of the time.
Perry, these Republicans argue, is an extremist who did much more than just vote to overturn the 2020 election results.
When votes are accepted under unconstitutional means without fair and equal protection for all, the only result can be an illegitimate outcome. Illegitimate.
In the lead up to January 6th, Perry repeatedly pushed for Trump to install fellow election denier Jeffrey Clark as acting attorney general and was investigated for his efforts to subvert the 2020 election.
As you will see, Representative Perry contacted the White House in the weeks after January 6th to seek a presidential pardon. Multiple other Republican congressmen also sought presidential pardons for their roles in attempting to overturn the 2020 election.
Last December, Perry was ordered to turn over more than 1,600 text messages, emails, and other communications to federal prosecutors investigating Trump's attempt to block the peaceful transfer of power. Snyder hopes that voters see Stelson as a level-headed alternative to Perry, who didn't make himself available to NewsHour for this piece.
Voters in this district voted for Donald Trump in 2020. They consistently have voted for Scott Perry. So what makes you think that this time could be any different?
This is not some member of the AOC squad coming in to sort of impose progressivism on central Pennsylvania. This is a moderate who easily, in an earlier time, not that long ago, could have run as a Republican. We know that there are enough Republicans in this district to split their tickets because Josh Shapiro, our governor, carried this district against Doug Mastriano, another extremist MAGA candidate like Scott Perry. Shapiro carried this district by 12%.
Well, I began my career with Ronald Reagan.
But in a district that leans red, Perry supporters, like longtime Republican operative Charlie Giroux, are confident Perry will survive the challenge.
He does a great job with constituent service, but he also mirrors the attitudes and opinions of the district. His military service is something that people respect, and his conservative values all really work in that district.
We've encountered people who call themselves lifelong Republicans who say that part of why they're not supporting Scott Perry this time around is because of his efforts to overturn the 2020 election, his involvement in January 6th and around January 6th. What's your response to that?
Well, the whole thing around January 6th is, in my judgment, merely a talking point, not anything that has real grounding in the district, because if it was a significant factor, it would have shown 2 years ago, and it clearly didn't. There have been folks that have said we're not for the Republican candidate who are Republicans for as long as I can remember. They were against Ronald Reagan, they were against George Bush. Now they're against Donald Trump and Scott Perry. But I'm going to tell you that in the 10th district, Donald Trump's going to do very well and Scott Perry's going to do exceedingly well.
Trump loyalists like Charlie might have history on their side, but ground in this competitive district could be shifting. According to a recent poll conducted between late May and early June, Perry and Trump were leading their respective races until a jury convicted the former president on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. Support for both candidates dropped in the district. Perry's 7-point lead over Stelson fell to 1 point, a statistical dead heat. The Republicans we spoke to voted for Perry in the past, but now see him as an extension of pro-Trump extremism. Beyond January 6th, some criticize Perry's votes against funding for Ukraine, Israel, and keeping the government open.
They're tired of people that won't cross the aisle to work with the other people, and they're tired of people that are so far one way or the other that they can't see any other point of view. And that sums up Scott Perry's politics.
Those extreme positions, I feel, are out of step with where I am, and I think with many people in this area, and I don't see that changing in the future, so I think we need to have a change in our representative.
We're trying to get 20,000 votes.
In the end, Snyder hopes his fight against Perry convinces more Republicans to reject the man who he feels made his party unrecognizable.
Sometimes if you can draw people to the ballot to vote for somebody in a lower office, a down ballot office, that once they've made that decision, they will carry the same sort of, principles up the ballot as well. If we can highly motivate people to vote against Perry, they may well decide that they can't at the same time vote for Trump. We just have to give them a permission structure, tell them that other Republicans are doing this, that they are not becoming progressive Democrats by casting this vote.
But in a district that voted for Trump by 4 points in 2020, that could be a tall order.
Despite various attempts, Scott Perry did not sit down with us for an interview, but we asked his campaign about the concerns raised by some Republican voters in his district. His campaign spokesperson said in a statement to NewsHour that, quote, despite being targeted by DC's radical left groups time and time again, the voters will again support him this November because they know his track record and that Scott Perry is working tirelessly for them.
Laura, thank you for that reporting. I want to shift our focus now and ask you about some news you broke earlier today about an executive action that President Biden is expected to take very soon. Tell us about it.
So next Tuesday, Jeff, the White House is going to hold an event that is marking the 12th anniversary of the Obama-era Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which protected migrants that were brought to the U.S. as children. And 6 sources familiar told me, you, as well as our colleague Amna Nawaz, that they expect that the White House, that the president is going to announce an executive action that is going to shield certain undocumented migrants at that event. And that expected executive action is going to specifically apply to undocumented spouses of U.S. citizens, will protect them from deportation, give them access to work permits, and likely ease their pathway to citizenship. Now, sources also told me that those undocumented spouses that this executive action is expected to apply to would have to have been in the U.S. for roughly 5 to 10 years to receive this benefit. And this action could also potentially protect some dreamers, those DACA recipients we just talked about, providing some of them some work visas.
So how many people overall would potentially be affected by this?
Immigrant advocate groups have estimated about 1.1 million people could benefit from this, but sources close to the White House expect this executive action to be much more narrow in scope, and it could affect around 500,000 instead of that 1.1 million. And I should add that a White House official told me that there's no final decision has been made, that this is still fluid, but sources close to the White House really expect that come Tuesday, the president is going to announce some protections for undocumented spouses of U.S. citizens.
And Laura, this could be, have to underscore and emphasize the word could because it's still taking shape, this could be the biggest relief program since DACA. What's the expected political impact here?
And mentioning DACA, Jeff, that came out in June of 2012, President Barack Obama's re-election year. He went on to win re-election that year. But multiple Democratic polling firms told me that their polling shows that a majority of voters, some 74%, support this type of relief for undocumented spouses of U.S. citizens. And Latino voters in battleground states who are currently not supporting President Biden move towards supporting him by double digits when they find out that he's considering this type of relief for undocumented spouses. And again, multiple sources also told me that President Biden's campaign and the White House is well aware of this data. So this is something that they're clearly keeping in mind when they're looking towards this new potential executive action.
Laura Barone-Lopez, thanks so much for this terrific reporting. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Over the past decade, the number of school mass shootings has increased, leaving school officials across the country struggling with questions of how to best protect students and staff and secure campuses. This past year, a number of states have either approved or are considering new measures that would allow a teacher to carry a gun in the classroom. Polls show that the majority of Americans don't favor arming teachers, but there are varying views among parents, teachers, and educators. We're going to hear from some of them now before Stephanie Tsai talks to an expert on school security.
I'm Ileana Gonzalez, and I live in Austin, Texas. I've been a teacher for 22 years, thinking that people charged with loving and caring and guiding children would also be the people charged with shooting and killing the same child who might walk into their classroom one day. It's ludicrous. I can't begin to imagine the day that I would be prepared to kill one of my own students. I just can't.
My name is Jan Hubler, and I live in Oregon. With all the school shootings that are going on, I think that it would just have armed staff, trained armed staff, I should say. It would be just an additional layer of protection for the kids.
My name is Astrobal Quintero, and I live in New Orleans, Louisiana. I do know that Army staff makes me extremely nervous. That seems counterproductive for the goal of making sure that schools feel safe, especially considering that statistics around people using guns in self-defense are very underwhelming.
I am Amy Atlas, and I live in Valatia, New York. My son is 16, goes to public school, and I don't think it should be required. I think that's really an unfair thing to ask a teacher to take on. But setting that aside, if you're a teacher, an administrator, and as long as you have the board's approval, I think it should be okay.
If we're going to pull out a wand, yeah, I want legislation that improves the conditions around gun ownership and accessibility to gun ownership, period, end of story. Teaching is a crazy, hard profession. It is super stressful. It's underpaid, it's taxing, you're emotionally exhausted, you are physically exhausted at the end of the day. I can't imagine also being combat trained and like having to find the wherewithal to manage yourself in a combat setting.
There are procedures and protocols in schools right now, but since we live in a rural area where we have no local police force, we have to call and get a dispatch to come down. So it's, half hour before we, would have anybody here. There is state police in the area too, but it's going to take a while. They, are about a half hour away to the other end. And so I think it would be a good thing for us to have in our schools.
So many of us view like students as our own kids. Like the very idea, like of having to shoot a child is like, I would be very shocked to see the teacher or administrator who'd be willing to do that.
Maybe a license isn't enough. Maybe they need to go through another sort of training that's specific to school and when you should, when you shouldn't, that kind of thing.
There's also the logistical component involved in what it would take to actually arm teachers. It would be an expense, not just in terms of the firearm, but the amount of training that would also need to be paid for, but also just the time investment.
I do feel like most people, staff, students, families would be extremely uncomfortable with the idea of admin or staff at school being armed and being like the first line of defense against a school shooter. The reckoning that a lot of us have kind of come to terms with as teachers is like, we don't really know what the solution is, like at all. That's kind of what makes it really scary.
In recent months, Tennessee and Iowa have joined more than 2/3 of states that allow teachers to carry guns in public schools when permitted by their school districts. There are 16 states, plus the District of Columbia, that have laws that prohibit teachers from carrying guns at school. For more on the implications of these policies, I'm joined by Kenneth Trump, president of National School Safety and Security Services. Ken, you're a school safety consultant. You've testified before Congress, putting aside the fact that the powerful NRA lobby is behind arming teachers at schools. Is there a valid argument that arming teachers may deter school shootings?
Well, we find that the vast majority of teachers want to be armed with technology and textbooks, but not firearms. And in those states that have authorized it, there's a big difference between authorizing it, making it legal to do it, versus those that have actually taken up the law and decided to actually do so. We're finding a very small number of school districts in states are allowing that to happen. It's just not something that's on their agenda. Look, if we're talking about arming teachers and support staff, we're talking about tasking them with performing a public safety function. We would want a trained, certified public safety professional, a police officer, to take on that role, just like we want a trained, certified teacher to teach in the classroom. We wouldn't take a police officer off the street at midnight shift in the back alley, give them a couple dozen hours of training and say, you're now a second grade teacher, enjoy the rest of your career.
So are you saying that the policy is hard to implement, but not necessarily ineffective or bad policy?
Well, it is a bad policy, in my opinion, because it's a high-risk, high-liability proposition. And the key is just what you said, implementation. If you listen to the voices of those teachers, they've brought out some really important issues of implementation, not just the law, but how would it work in a school on a day-to-day basis. The one powerful statement about you're asking me to take a kid that I love, support, nurture, and feel like the parent for that day during the school day, and then say that I might have to turn around and shoot and kill them. There's a psychological piece to this, because training someone for a couple dozen hours on how to shoot, clean, and holster the gun is a lot less than what we require of our trained public safety professionals out in the community, our police officers, but with use of force continuum, shoot, don't shoot. What's the scenario? How do you gauge the situation? How are you evaluating it? What intermittent steps can you take to de-escalate without having to immediately turn to the firearm? And then just how would it work during the day? Where are the teachers going to store their guns? How are they going to have, who's going to have access to those? And lastly, who's going to be managing all this? The principal is now the de facto police chief, in addition to the principal, to make sure that teachers have the current certification, the right firearm, the right qualifications and training, the right type of ammunition, that they're carrying it right, what procedures for disciplinary. You start getting into these weeds, and it's a really big task, in addition to being educators and administrators during the day, that really goes beyond a reality of fidelity of implementation if somebody picks that up. So there's a lot more than saying you can do it. The question is, how would you do it? And I say it's very problematic.
On the other extreme, Ken, you have these states that have issued blanket bans prohibiting teachers from carrying firearms in their school. Is that good policy? Because in that piece, you also heard from that rural teacher who said the police are half an hour away. And proponents of arming teachers say, shouldn't that teacher have the right to carry a gun for her own self-defense and to defend her students?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest arguments comes from rural areas where you have small or sometimes very, very tiny police departments that are far, far away. My answer to that is we have school resource officer programs, police officers in school. If it's that big of a priority to have an armed presence on campus, then invest your district resources. Some states, many states now, actually put on additional levies where voters can vote to determine if they want to pay additional security costs, and bring yourself a dedicated full-time officer for your school or school district on a day-to-day basis who will be there. Put your money into that priority, but do it right. It's an issue of not have it. You can't have it both ways. You can't think about it. We're asking in many school communities today, it's a very contentious issue of having police in school, period, especially after the murder of George Floyd. I think they're very conflicting messages. I think the argument for having an armed presence on campus is a trained, commissioned, certified police officer with the appropriate model, the right officer, and the additional training. If you're going to do it right.
Kenneth Trump, a school safety consultant. Thanks so much for joining the NewsHour.
Thanks for having me, Stephanie.
In 2022, Steve McQueen, the British-born son of Caribbean immigrants, was knighted for his work as a filmmaker and artist, the two worlds in which he's achieved commercial and critical success. His latest work takes his art in yet another new direction. Jeffrey Brown recently joined McQueen for a look for our Arts and Culture series, Canvas.
An enormous hall, bathed in slowly shifting colors, filled with improvised music created by bass instruments. It can feel like walking through a strange city or dreamscape, like scenes from the pandemic, or being inside an immense abstract painting.
It's a space to reflect. It's not a mirror, it's a space where things are bouncing off you as a viewer, and you can expand it into something more, because so many things come into your head. The fact that you bring your history, you bring your past into that space, and you are engaged in that moment.
So I'm part of this art experience.
How can you not be? How can you not be?
Well, boy, how you feel now?
Steve McQueen is best known for his films. He's the Academy Award-winning director of 2013's 12 Years a Slave. Earlier movies, including Hunger.
I'm starting a hunger strike on the 1st of March.
More recently, the Small Axe series.
We mustn't be victims, but protagonists of our stories.
Soon, the Nazis started to ban Jews from parks.
And the documentary Occupied City, about Amsterdam during World War II. But he first made his name in the 1990s for his art. And at the Dia Beacon Museum, a converted Nabisco box factory on the Hudson River in Beacon, New York, he once again straddles both worlds.
I always acquaint art as poetry and film as the yarn, as a novel. Using the same tools, doing virtually the same thing, but doing it differently.
And so you're not interested in labels of, if I ask you, do you see yourself as an artist or as a filmmaker? Or?
I do stuff.
I do stuff.
I do stuff. No, I'm very privileged to do stuff, and I work very hard because I know I'm privileged that I'm allowed to do stuff in order to sort of, have an understanding or have some kind of feeling of what work could be.
Most of his previous artworks are video installations, shown here in still photos, and use recognizable images. The installation at Dia Beacon, titled Base, in a 30,000 square foot basement space, is perhaps his most abstract work yet. One chief material, light, a longtime fascination for McQueen. Here he has 60 light boxes subtly change color through the spectrum every 28 minutes.
The whole idea of the intensity of light, that makes color, and the whole idea of what we see in our perceptions and so forth and whatnot. And I was just interested in having, I wanted it all. I wanted the color to encapsulate everything. And of
When
course,
you say you wanted it all, you mean all of the light and all of the changes?
everything that surrounds us. Again, it's a kind of dawn to dusk thing. You want to sort of embrace it, but of course it's impossible. But light is the thing which sort of in some ways can illustrate that.
The light and colors bring out the space in new ways. The cracks in the old floors, the surfaces of pillars, the history of what was once a place of work and workers. McQueen's other main material here, sound. Improvised music filling the space from 3 speaker stacks by 5 musicians from different parts of the African diaspora who play different kinds of electric and acoustic bass instruments. They got together to record this 3-hour-plus soundtrack in the exhibition space.
It's the sort of base of most music. It's the backbone. But I want to bring that thing which is usually in the background into the foreground and to have 5 bassists.
In fact, while this may be an abstract, image-free work, McQueen began it with his own narrative in mind, a story of trauma, of limbo and passage, the so-called Middle Passage, the transatlantic voyage that brought enslaved Africans to the Americas, including the voyages of his own family from Africa to the Caribbean to England.
I was thinking about how black people are post-apocalyptic people.
Post-apocalyptic.
In the sense that we've had to invent and reinvent ourselves. This transatlantic crossing, the sort of middle passage.
Mm-hmm.
This space of limbo, as it were. And therefore, what that journey entails, but also what, of course, the horrors of it, but also the sort of what was positive about it in some ways. I mean, nothing was positive, but at the same time of how people survived it. I mean, I am here sitting with you, opposite you, as an example of that survival.
But McQueen wants us to take our own walk and bring our feelings and history to the experience. Dia Art Foundation curator Donna DeSalvo worked with him on this commission, a partnership with the Swiss Museum.
I think it's also about what art can do, with the experience. And I kind of like that there's, in a way, not this standard image that you might imagine would be, because there's an openness to that. I mean, actually, in its way, it's very much about the viewer and what they want to bring. You're not told what to do, you're not told what to think, you're not told how to move, but there are conditions that are created here, inevitably, by the artist, and that he wants you to have an experience with and respond to.
McQueen puts it this way.
Everyone tries to cling on to narrative because it's something like safety rails in a swimming pool. Because as soon you let go, oh my God, I'm floating, I don't know, but it's...
Well, it helps us find a way.
Yes, but you have to feel comfortable with floating because you can actually float, let go, unclutch, feel it, relax, lay into it, feel what you feel. Again, I feel that is sort of the key to experiencing the work. Things emerge. Heavy stuff emerges.
Base remains on view into April of next year. Steve McQueen's next work, a dramatic film set amid the London Blitz in World War II. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jeffrey Brown at Dia Beacon in Beacon, New York.
Remember, there's more online, including our communities correspondent Adam Kemp's look at how Oklahoma researchers are trying to send severe weather alerts in more languages.
And join us again here tomorrow night when David Brooks and E.J. Dion weigh in on the week's political headlines. And that is the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Jeff Bennett.
And I'm Amna Navaz. On behalf of the entire NewsHour team, thank you for joining us.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
moving our economy for 160 years. BNSF, the engine that connects us.
the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions, and friends of the NewsHour, including Leonard and Norma Chlorfine, and the Judy and Peter Bloom Kovler Foundation. The Ford Foundation, working with visionaries on the front lines of social change worldwide. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. And friends of the NewsHour. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.